Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
Have you said goodbye to ever being a minister? I mean, I
hope
think
so.
You hope so.
Oh, I hope so.
Freedom, the high seas, and rebellion. Now, I could be describing a new TV period drama or a spin-off of Game of Thrones. But who needs fiction when you have Westminster? I'm Christopher Hope, the chief political correspondent of the Daily Telegraph and chopper to my pals. And this is Chopper's Politics. And today I have a fantastic gaggle of guests for you listeners, including Richard Johnstone-Bryden, the official biographer of the Royal Yacht Britannia. And he argues you wouldn't question why the US needs a new Air Force One, so why question a replacement for Britannia? Plus, I'll be joined by William Wragg MP, one of the most rebellious Conservative MPs when it comes to voting against his own government. He'll talk about what motivates him and whether he's ruled himself out of ever becoming a government minister. But first, freedom, the rallying cry of Mel Gibson in the film Braveheart, and also what the SNP thinks it will be offering the people of Scotland in its pursuit of another referendum on Scottish independence. This week, that debate about the State of the Union took a turn when Michael Gove, who leads for the government on the Union, told my Telegraph colleague, our political editor Ben Riley-Smith, that the PM won't grant a second Scottish referendum before the 2024 general election.
I don't think so. I think it's foolish to talk about a referendum now. We're recovering from COVID. We are still dealing with the health challenges that the COVID crisis has generated. And it seems to me to be at best reckless, at worst folly, to try to move the conversation on to constitutional division when people expect us to be working together in order to deal with these challenges.
So that is pretty clear. Your position is there will be no referendum before the 2024 election.
I can't see it.
Well, Ben Riley-Smith, you got some news there from Michael Gove, didn't you? It's quite clear he thinks there shouldn't be any referendum on Scottish independence before 2024.
Exactly. Why I thought that was so interesting is the UK government position has this line, which is whenever they're asked about another referendum, they say, not for now because we're dealing with the pandemic. And they think that is a politically defensible line because the virus is killing people. It's at the top of everybody's priorities list. And a lot of Scots, according to opinion polls, don't want to hold a referendum now. But what they're less reluctant to say, but when you talk to anybody around Boris Johnson, is that they are not going to grant a referendum anytime soon unless something huge changes. And so by framing the question around the 2024 election, Gove kind of let slip what the real position is, which is not this year, not next year, not the year after, not the year after. They're just not going to grant a referendum.
Maybe not ever. And how has Nicola Sturgeon reacted to this story when it appeared on the front page of Wednesday Telegraph?
Furiously. She did an interview with the Press Association where she accused Gove of arrogant condescension and this sneering attitude towards Scotland and her calls for a second referendum, and actually claimed that it would drive up support for independence. Now, that's quite interesting because what you're going to see, I think, over the next couple of years is the SNP repeatedly framing the argument like this, saying it's posh, English, Tory London, which is denying the Scottish right, the democratic right to hold a referendum.
So will it end up in the courts, do you think? I mean, that certainly in your interview with Ian Blackford as he fed lambs on his croft in Skye, he did say that he holded out the idea of it ending up in a court case.
The UK government has indicated that they will not take the Scottish government to court. Let's see what happens if we end up going down that road. I hope we don't. I think it's far better if the two governments come together and we can reach agreement. But there's nothing in the legislation, I would argue, that precludes the Scottish Parliament seeking to test the will of the people of Scotland as to whether they wish independence or not.
What happened last time was 2011, the SNP won a majority in Holyrood. David Cameron agreed to hold a referendum because he thought they could win it. So the UK government, UK Parliament gave permission to Scotland to hold it. They held it and the UK won. This time it's a totally different situation. They want to hold one, but we're saying no. And if we keep saying no, there is only one route for the SNP, which is to say, well, we're going to plough ahead anyway. We're going to pass a bill in the Scottish Parliament to hold a referendum. And if you challenge that, then it's going to end up in the courts. It's quite a knotty legal question because the powers over the Constitution remain with the UK Parliament. So you would imagine there's no way you can hold a binding referendum in Scotland that would take Scotland out of the Union without any say from UK Parliament. But what the SNP try and do is they say, OK, but what about if it's an advisory referendum? Essentially, it's just a big opinion poll. Isn't that legal? Why can't we do that? And that's going to be the debate that plays out in the Supreme Court ultimately.
And the UK response will be to boycott that advisory referendum, presumably.
Yeah, if you got to that point, then the pro-UK side will say, right, all our supporters don't turn out, this is a joke referendum. So actually the SNP is in more of a bind than you might think right now.
And there are questions they haven't yet answered at all about currency, about head of state, defence, border. All those issues are unaddressed by the SNP at the moment.
Absolutely. I was up there for the 2014 referendum and they essentially lost largely because of the economic financial question. What would the currency be in Scots' pockets the day after independence or a year after independence? They tried to say, we'll keep the pound, it'll be fine. George Osborne, the Chancellor at the time, came up and said, no, you won't. We're not going to let you keep the pound. And they had this terrible bind that they struggled to get out of. To be honest, 7 years later, we're not much further than that. They're still saying we'll keep the pound for a bit, but eventually we'll do an independent currency. But that's just one issue. Like you say, borders, Brexit. We're 5 years on, we still don't know quite what the situation is going to be in our Northern Ireland land border. What would the situation be in England, Scotland? The SNP want to take Scotland back into the European Union. So suddenly you're creating a new land border under their idea. The edge of the EU would be the Scottish border. So I think all those questions Downing Street's keen to focus on.
So Michael Gove's position is to spend heavily in Scotland and make sure they know it's British stuff, and that's a problem. I was struck by what Gordon Brown said about that. You in his garden, I imagine, when you interviewed him.
Yeah.
The UK wants to work with Scotland and wants the United Kingdom to work as an entity, then there's got to be an effort on the part of the UK government to offer that hand of cooperation. And I feel that this is something that is missing in the armoury of the UK government. And when they talk about muscular unionism, what they mean is actually bypassing the Scottish government, putting up flags in Scotland to emphasise the importance of Britishness. What they also would do is build roads and label them British roads, not Scottish roads, and that just won't work.
So he's saying that it may be seen as a kind of colonial thing, so paving Scotland to save the Union, and which I never thought about that idea, but of course he's right, that could be how it's perceived by opponents.
Yeah, so Downing Street has dabbled with something that's been dubbed muscular unionism, so you need to be more on the front foot, selling the benefits of the union to Scots. And part of that is branding lots of things with UK flags that Gordon Brown was very against, or said that's not the way you're going to save the union. Part of it is making clear that the financial benefits of being part of the UK are very clear. So it is Britain that is paying for certain bits of infrastructure. An argument you hear a lot about now is the pandemic has actually showed the strength of having the Treasury being able to support with furlough in Scotland and everywhere else.
And vaccination, of course. And
they sent in the UK Army to help with some of the COVID pandemic stuff in Scotland. But I think what rankles with Brown is the idea that there's a tone in some of that debate, which is you guys should be grateful for what you've got, and you don't know how good you've got it. And certainly off the record, the other pro-UK figures have told me that when the PM and others make that argument, it rankles even with Scots who support the union. So it's a very tough balance.
Isn't that replicating what the EU do? The EU put their badges on bridges or roads in Scotland, and there's no problem there at all.
No, it's so hard because, we're 7, 8, 9 years into this point when there's a real possibility that independence could happen. And the UK government are in this tricky position because they want to sell the benefits of the union. They want to try and re-engage Scots with the importance of the union. And yet when they drill down into ways they try and do that, there's a danger actually you can seem heavy-handed. So it is a very difficult balance.
One of Gove's ideas is to deploy Boris Johnson north of the border, which I think Alan Cochrane may be less keen on. I couldn't work it out. I think he's less keen on Boris coming north.
I'm actually less worried about the outcome this time, although there are two big issues have occurred since you were last here. Both start with B. One's called Boris and the other one's called Brexit, neither of which are particularly good news for Scotland.
Is Boris the answer to the Scottish question?
Well, Gove put out an argument for why he was.
In my experience, I've seen folk in Orkney, folk in Aberdeenshire responding as warmly to the Prime Minister as people in Oxfordshire or Hartlepool. So, I think it's an SNP mind game, as it were, to try to suggest that somehow the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom shouldn't set foot in part of the United Kingdom.
One of the calls of that argument is we had Scottish elections last month, and he said people used to say Cameron was more popular than Boris in Scotland. People used to say Brexit would weigh us down. People used to say Ruth Davidson had a power that her successor, Douglas Ross, doesn't. And yet they got the highest number of seats they've ever got in that election. So he was saying it's a bit of a myth that Boris is weighing us down. The truth is the opinion polls appear to show at least that his approval ratings are very severely in the negative in Scotland. And also I think the biggest indication you can tell is by just looking at the facts of how often he's going up there. And he isn't going every month or every week. He's probably been a couple of times in the last 6 months. He didn't really play much of a central role in the Tory campaign in Scotland last month. So it remains to be seen. Certainly Douglas Ross at times has been happy, let's say, to put the PM at a slight distance while he's trying to make his pitch to the Scottish people.
Douglas Ross called for the former chief advisor Dominic Cummings to resign, didn't he, after Barnard Castle when he was the advisor to the PM. So there's been often a case of just distancing the Unionists or the Scottish Unionist Tory party from the English party.
Yeah, and that's one of the huge challenges the UK parties have, because fundamentally the Tories, the Labour, as a UK-wide party, their power base is in London, and the SNP's power base is in Edinburgh. So Scottish Labour, Scottish Tories always argue they are from and of the Scottish people, but it's difficult because the number one person in those parties is in Westminster.
How do you find those students you spoke to in Glasgow University?
They were passionately pro-independence.
And they were tuned into austerity, weren't they? Even though they were quite young when that happened in 2010, 11, 12, they seemed to recognise that, how it affected their lives.
Growing up right in the middle of the 2008 economic crisis, I was in primary school when that happened, and it hit my family hard. And, the reaction to that was austerity. And if you come from a age group like ours, where we've had economic crisis after economic crisis, we need to see a route out of that. And independence, in my opinion, and a lot of young people's opinions, offers an escape for that.
Yeah, and they were quite interesting, because I was saying, at what point do you realise you have no connection, or you want to distance yourself from the UK and form an independent Scotland? One of the big messages, in fact, the campaign, pro-UK campaign in 2014 was called Better Together. And they said that is totally illusory. Supposedly we're better together, and yet London is imposing year after year after year of spending cuts on the Scots during austerity.
But the UK won that in the teeth of austerity. 2014, austerity was still the government policy, and yet the union won.
Well, that's what's interesting. 2014, younger voters backed the union. In 2021, polls suggest a very clear majority of younger voters in Scotland back independence. And the big question is it one of those things that as you get older and older, you get a house, you get a job, and you lean towards a more conservative leaning? Or actually, is this a huge generational change that it's only a matter of time that flows through the rest of the demographic and independence happens?
Alan Cochrane, our Scottish editor, formerly now columnist, was very clear that there should be no more powers for the Scottish Parliament. Is that right? Do you think, in terms of the UK side? I
asked Michael Gove the same question. He said, didn't quite go that far, but said it's not the priority right now. The Scottish Parliament has a lot of powers and it should start using those before it asks for more. On your film, you did show quite clearly how those border seats in Scotland are Conservative. Why is that? Are they worried about the impact of a hard border on their lives? Well, when I went to the border and had a conversation with politicians who lived there, and we were right by the border, and there were cars whizzing back and forth and lorries whizzing back and forth every second. So I think absolutely, if you live there are a lot of people in Gretna who work in Carlisle and back. Their livelihoods depend on crossing that border very easily. So what's your next film going to be about? Touring England and seeing if they want the Scots to bugger off? I don't know. I'm not going to bite on that. You've got a day job in London. Let's see. Yeah, exactly. I'm still down in London, so I don't want to trigger a backlash. Now, Ben Riley-Smith, you asked Michael Gove, will there be a referendum before the next election in 2024? I'm going to ask you, will there be a Scottish referendum before 2030, Ben Riley-Smith? Before 2030, I'll stretch my neck out, and as long as Boris Johnson is Prime Minister, I'd be amazed if he grants a second referendum. Well, Ben Riley-Smith, our political editor, a really good film here about your tour of Scotland, how you went in, what you wore different clothes for all different politicians. That made me laugh, but it's great to see you, and I do recommend it to all our listeners, and we'll put it in the show notes to this episode. But thank you for joining us this week on Chopper's Politics. Thank you. Thanks very much, Chris. Now,
Now, a link to the Telegraph's documentary about Scottish independence is in the show notes to this episode, and I really recommend you to watch it, if only to watch Ian Blackford feed a lamb. It's lovely. And if you want to read more of Ben's top analysis, and you're not already a Telegraph subscriber, please go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper to get your first month completely free of charge, and then just 50p a month for the next 2. Right. Next, I'll be talking about the benefits of sailing the seven seas in a new replacement Royal Yacht Britannia. Right after this.
We're interrupting this podcast to bring you news of another Telegraph show we think you might like. It's called Planet Normal, and it's hosted by me, Liam Halligan.
And me, Alison Pearson. We're both Telegraph columnists who share the view that far too often those who shout the loudest on the telly just don't represent the views of normal people.
So take a trip with us to Planet Normal. We're joined by some stellar guests, well-known voices from politics, business and the arts.
All from different fields, but they have one thing in common. They're at the top of their game, but distinctly down to earth. The good news is I finally learnt what a podcast is and even how you subscribe to it. It's actually quite simple. Search for Planet Normal on your podcast app or click on the link in the show notes for this episode.
You don't really know what a podcast is, do you?
I am one. Look, I am one. Who needs to know what it is? I am one, okay? Shut up.
Now, if you're a long-time listener of Chopper's Politics and its predecessor Chopper's Brexit podcast, you may have noticed there is one subject I've accidentally become an expert on over the past 6 years. There's been talk in the UK here for a replacement for the Royal Yacht Britannia. I wonder what you thought of that.
Well, I have been on the old Britannia a long, long time ago.
Now, Craig is not the only MP calling for a successor to HMY Britannia to be built. But maybe before long we'll see a new yacht in the harbour at Auckland. At the weekend you were saying that we should have a new Royal Yacht Britannia. I started by asking him whether he thought a new Royal Yacht. Yes, I'm talking about the replacement for the Royal Yacht Britannia. Now, since 2016, I've written nearly 40 articles about this for the Daily Telegraph, which has been running its own campaign for a replacement for the yacht, which was decommissioned by Tony Blair in 1997. And about a month ago, there was some good news on this campaign from Boris Johnson when he announced that a new national flagship to replace it will enter service in 4 years' time, with the aim of giving British business a new global platform. But this week, there have been whispers in Westminster that Chancellor Rishi Sunak is concerned about the 200 million potential cost of this new ship and is concerned about how to pay for it. And to make matters worse, former Tory Chancellor Lord Clark, known as Ken Clark when he was a Tory MP, described those plans as a complete waste of time. Well, somebody who disagrees with Lord Clark is maritime historian and the official biographer of the Royal Yacht Britannia, Richard Johnstone-Bryden. And he joins me right now to talk about whether the plans for a new flagship can weather this difficult squall. Richard Johnstone-Bryden, the official biographer of HMY Britannia. Why do we need another one?
Well, it was a great misfortune that Britannia was retired without replacement in 1997. We had a unique diplomatic and trade promotion asset, which was the envy of world leaders across the globe.
Yeah, but the problem here was that it didn't have cross-party support when John Major tried to recommission one in early 97.
Well, I think that was unfortunately down to a lack of leadership in the mid-1990s when they first discussed the issue of retiring or replacing Britannia. At that stage, she was actually being used for several high-profile events which, had the government of the day decided to get behind the replacement of Britannia, they could have built a very, very strong case for her replacement. She was being used for the high-profile state visits to Russia, to South Africa. She'd been used in the major D-Day fleet review in the Solent, and her trade promotional activities that were organised on the back of the various royal visits were really starting to build some momentum. So again, you could have built a very good case and made a good argument.
But it didn't happen. And do you think the fact that Labour hasn't yet signed up to the new idea from Boris Johnson for a national flagship to replace Britannia is a problem?
I think it's unfortunate. I do think if you look at Britannia's story, the beginning and the end of it shows you the perfect way to go about the building of a yacht and the perfect way of not going about the yacht. In the 50s, Clement Attlee, who was the Prime Minister at the time, managed to announce the building of Britannia on the eve of a general election without it turning into a huge political scandal, because he'd gone and done his homework beforehand. He'd gone and consulted the opposition leaders, gained their support, and therefore there was that cross-party support for the new yacht, and he could announce it without any problems whatsoever. And it was very prudent as well, because as that election turned out, there was a new Prime Minister in the form of Winston Churchill. So he then carried on with the programme uninterrupted without any issues. Unfortunately, in the 90s, the government of the day did not engage properly with the opposition parties.
That's the Tories with Labour. Labour were resurgent, weren't they, in the 90s? That's why.
Yeah, but they didn't engage. And if they had actually had people on board the yacht, explained the yacht's role, showed her in action both diplomatically and in the trade role, my own view is that there would have been some real support. And in fact, it's interesting that I have seen interviews where Tony Blair has subsequently admitted that retiring Britannia without replacement was actually a mistake.
So let's move on to this new idea, this Boris Johnson idea for a new national flagship to replace the Royal Yacht Britannia. A flagship, not a yacht. Is that important?
I think the term is actually, as a historian, I'm very sorry to see the dispensing of the term yacht. However, I believe on a political level, it's absolutely the right thing to do, because the meaning of the word yacht has changed over the course of the centuries from when it was first applied to Britannia's predecessors. And originally it meant it was a ship of state that was used to convey heads of state and senior officials from that nation from A to B. However, in modern parlance, vessels the size of Britannia that are described as a yacht are ships that have been built by the wealthy, in many cases as an ostentatious display of wealth, enjoyed purely for their private pleasure. And therefore, for people who've not had any experience of Britannia and really didn't know anything about her role, it's very easy to seize on the term yacht and turn that into a very negative campaign very, very quickly.
Is that why you think that the idea of a new replacement polls so low? So you, Gov, have it around 1 in 4, just over 1 in 4 people think it's a good idea. Although if you break it down, it appears that people of an older generation and also bizarrely conservative voters, a majority of those people support the idea.
Yeah, I think that's probably a lot to it. I think one of the lessons that needs to be learned from Britannia's experience is that if the ship goes ahead, that you need to involve members of each of the political parties from day one and throughout its time in service. Show it in action, explain what the yacht does, or flagship as we should now be describing it. And I think if you do that, you remove all of that political angst from the discussion.
Now, this week, Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, said it could cost 0.1% of his defence budget, around £40 million. Some forecasts, I've seen papers showing £200 million. Do you think that's money well spent? Is there a cost-benefit analysis for that money being spent in Whitehall somewhere?
Yeah, I think in terms of projecting the nation's image on the international stage, both diplomatically and commercially, it's a very small figure. If you look, the nearest comparison to Britannia is Air Force One. It is the only other, and any yachtsman listening to this, please forgive me for what I'm about to say, but it is the only other mode of transport that has instant worldwide recognition. If you say Air Force One to someone, they immediately think of the two 747s that are used to fly the president around the world. At the moment, the Americans are in the process of replacing the current generation of 747s, and that program is currently due to cost over $5 billion, and that's including things like the hangars and all the rest of it. And there are expectations that figure will probably grow to $6 billion. Now, for that money, all you are getting is an aircraft that flies the president from A to B. It does represent America. It represents the presidency. It also represents their rich aviation heritage. And Britannia was very much the same. But with Air Force One, once it flies into an airport, which is usually behind several layers of security, so the local population have no ability to really join in with that whole event of the arrival or departure, it plays no further role in the state visit. The president doesn't stay on it. He can't entertain on it. He can't host trade receptions on board it. And then he flies out again. Britannia was a very different asset. When she arrived, the arrival was a major event. It would be into a great harbour somewhere. The local population could go and line the hills around the harbour, the quayside, etc. And it was a big event. The vessel would arrive with the standards flying, the Royal Marine Band playing on deck.
So what you're saying is the kind of comparator of a naval power that Britain was and maybe could be in the future could be represented by Britannia. And of course, the cost is different. How much is it costing to build 2 new Air Force Ones?
Well, they're talking about the total budget coming in at the moment at over $5 billion for that project. And there seems to be a widespread expectation that figure will probably actually come out nearer $6 billion. $6 billion. That is the cost of put it into context, the Navy has just built its 2 new world-class aircraft carriers for just under £3 billion per ship. So it is a huge sum of money. The yacht, therefore, coming in at 200 million, although that is a figure that none of us will probably ever have in our lifetime, it is, in the overall scheme of things, is good value for money.
The difference, of course, between this idea and Britannia is there is no currently apparent royal family support for it. Do they want this new Britannia?
Well, I would never seek to speak on behalf of the royal family. The only thing I can tell you is that looking at the documentation for the beginning of Britannia, which spans 3 different reigns, none of those monarchs asked for a royal yacht. It was very much a project that came from the government as an asset to support their work, and therefore the royal household engaged with that process, and the plans were developed into what became a unique worldwide asset in support of the UK, both diplomatically and commercially. And I suspect that this project will go through a similar process.
Do you think, Richard, that this new ship can make money for this country? Matt Hancock talked about it this week as being moored in harbours and generating trade deals. Has that ever happened before?
Yeah. Britannia works on 2 levels, and I would actually describe her very much as the great facilitator. The first level is very much opening the door to the world's most senior politicians and business leaders. Because the one thing that Britannia brought for the sea days was that it was the opportunity for these people to come to the Queen's home. And that was a unique invitation, because if you are the head of Boeing, if you are the head of Ford or some other large corporation, you get an avalanche of invitations to go to the world's finest hotels and embassies for receptions. So having yet another invitation to listen to a pitch from the Secretary of State for Wales or from the Scottish government or whatever it is that you're trying to sell is just going to fall on deaf ears. If you can actually have that event hosted in the Queen's home, you will suddenly get people who will come in that will not attend any of the other trade initiatives that this country lays on in support of our interests overseas.
In today's Metro newspaper, Stephen Crawley wrote that if the Tories want to win favour, they should cancel the idea of this new royal yacht and spend the money on, say, on the houses of the poor souls who are going into residential care, look after them and forget about this new ship. And Ken Clarke, the former Tory Chancellor, said this week that it would be a complete waste of time. What's your answer to both Stephen Crawley and Lord Clarke?
Well, I think they're both promoting very important issues that require the government's attention. Lord Clarke, of course, was a key critic of the replacement of Britannia back in the 90s, and according to John Major's memoirs, was one of the key figures who blocked Britannia's replacement. So it's no surprise that he would be critical of any new vessel to replace her. But I think you have to look at the bigger picture. We now have a new direction on the international stage, and Britannia could play a very important part of the government's overall strategy. Because I think this is the thing. We have to look at this new ship as being part of the overall strategy. Because again, on the trade role, another role that she was very effective at was acting as a focal point for the signing of big contracts. And there's a classic example of this in India. John Major went out as Prime Minister to generate lots of new contracts in 1993. And because India has a fabulous bureaucracy that they have developed to perfection, a lot of these contracts take years to thrash out and in many cases fizzle out along the way. By following up the Prime Minister's visit with a visit of the Yacht 12 months later, it gave a firm date by which contracts had to be signed. Therefore, years of red tape was suddenly dispensed with so that these contracts could be signed in the presence of the British and Indian Foreign Secretaries. And over the course of 4 days, a total of £1.5 billion worth of contracts were signed on board the yacht, purely so that they had the prestige of signing in that environment with those leading politicians. No other vessel would have had that ability, and you wouldn't have had that in an embassy, because an embassy is there the whole time. You've got to have something that's only in town for a set date to achieve that effect.
And Richard Johnstone-Bryden, just finally, will this ship be built?
I hope so. I think this is the best chance to build a replacement for Britannia, and I think it could be a fabulous advertisement for the UK's shipbuilding and maritime industry. There are several yards there that have the capability. The fact that we've just built the 2 new aircraft carriers, which were a national endeavour involving 6 shipyards and 11,000 people around the whole UK, is a real good example of what can be achieved. And this yacht would achieve proof of a different level of capability.
Well, Richard Johnstone-Bryden, author of The Official History of Britannia. I know you're working on a new book about Britannia, so best of luck with that. Thank you for joining us this week on Choppers Politics.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Now, at the start of this show, I promised you rebellion, and rebellion you shall have, because my final guest today is a reminder that even when a government has a huge majority, it can easily be rocked by unprecedented events like a pandemic and MPs with a passion. This week, Conservative Home published a list of the most rebellious Tory MPs, and joint first place, alongside Sir Charles Walker and Esther McVeigh, was a new MP, William Wragg, the Tory MP for Hazel Grove in Manchester, only elected in 2015. So I thought I'd give him a ring and ask him what's bothering him.
William Wragg MP, Chairman of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, thank you for joining me this week on Choppers Politics.
Thank you for having me, Christopher.
Now, I've been in this game for so long, I know MPs love to be ranked compared to their rivals in Parliament. But you've topped an interesting list this week in Conservative Home. They ranked you as one of the 3 most rebellious Conservative MPs, and they listed the rebellions you rebelled on. I'll go through them quickly. Hawaii, Coronavirus Act 1, Rule of 6, Curfew, Lockdown, Tears, Genocide Amendment, Coronavirus Act 2, Coronavirus Regulations, and this week you added another one, which is voting with Labour against the government on reforms to the planning laws. What's going on?
Well, it's a dubious honour to be given, I suppose, isn't it? I think there's quite a common theme, though, to those that you read out. The coronavirus regulations being foremost. So perhaps there has been more opportunities for me to rebel on the basis of my general opposition to those regulations. I think you have to be careful it doesn't become habitual. So having you've just read out that list, I'm wondering if it is, frankly.
Well, it's certainly coronavirus based. You're concerned about the lockdown and its extent. You're worried about China, hence the Hawaii vote at the beginning there. And now the planning rules, which is affecting your constituents in Hazel Grove, that's worrying you. So I think it shows that you're in tune with you're listening to what people are telling you, what the public's telling you, what voters are telling you, taking a view, and then representing that in Parliament, which is your job, right?
Well, do that to my best of my ability. I think it's worth noting that probably well over 90% of the time I am voting exactly with the government on the whip, and so I think it's interesting to pick them out and to notice those themes. That by and large, any rebel will still, the vast majority of the time, be voting with the government as well.
How hard was it, the first rebellion you did? I know when you were elected in 2015, you were probably quite green around the gills. 6 years later, you know how the place works, how the place operates. But it's never easy, is it, to go against your own party?
The first time I rebelled was under David Cameron, and it was on Sunday trading laws, of all things.
That was summer 2015, wasn't it?
Oh, halcyon days. And I remember being summoned to see the then Prime Minister. And outside his Commons office is a chair. And the chair, much like the one outside the headmaster's office, is there for you to sit on. And his meetings are inevitably delayed. So you have to sit there and reflect for 20 minutes before you're called in. And I went in, and there was the Prime Minister, there was his then PPS, Gavin Williamson, and they sort of attempt to persuade you of the case as to why you should vote a certain way. And I remember it was very difficult, but I sort of maintained a line that I'd had time to reflect on, sat on the chair outside the office, and said that over and over again it went in my own mind. But I do recall almost feeling physically sick the first time I rebelled, and when that division bell rang, and whimpering into the opposite division lobby as to the one I was supposed to be in. And so the first time rebelling is always very difficult. But as with everything in life, things tend to get a bit easier. But I think, having you read out those various rebellions, maybe it's time for me to reflect on whether it's becoming a bit too habitual.
It's quite lonely, I imagine. When you could vote in person before the pandemic struck, you would literally walk into the no lobby, wouldn't you? Look around, and everyone is a Labour MP, and you almost feel like, my God, I'm with the wrong people.
Well, yes, you do. And, politics is a very tribal sport. And, despite having sort of the tendencies of a wonky shopping trolley in terms of going into division lobbies, you still want to be among your team in the lobby. But once you've run the gauntlet of the strategically placed whips, then you're home and dry as soon as you get through the door.
Yes. When you say their place, where are they? Are they at the edge of the division lobby, so they try and trip you up as you walk in, or something?
Well, no, I'm not saying that they've resorted to any physical effort, but it's far be it from me to say. But there's certainly a last-minute effort of persuasion.
Yes. Come over here for a drink, I can imagine.
Then for very, very serious votes, and if you're a rebel, then they can also place ministers and indeed on occasion the Prime Minister. And so you have to be pretty determined you're going to do it.
Yeah.
I've always said to colleagues, though, and the Government Whip's office will clearly not appreciate this remark, but I've always said to colleagues, if you tell the Government Whips that you're going to do something, i.e. vote in a different way, then you have to be absolutely sure that you do it. Because I always say to them, otherwise, next time they'll apply twice the pressure and think that you'll fold in half the time. So I think it's better if you say you're going to do something, you have to go through with it, no matter how difficult it might be.
Have you had some quite fruity messages from these whips when your plans have been made public?
I would say fruity messages at all. I'd say, obviously concerned messages.
Yes. More in sorrow, William.
More in sorrow than anger. But I think also the important thing is so you don't come across as being a person beyond the pale. It's also good to keep on friendly terms with the whips and try and keep personalities out of it, which is something I try and do.
Have you said goodbye to ever being a minister? I mean, I
hope
think
so.
You hope so?
Oh, I hope so.
You don't want to be in the government. You're happy playing your furrow. Well, you're the chairman of a major committee in Parliament, and that's paid for. So you get a bit of top up on your salary. So you're doing well there. All these things matter.
Well, I suppose it's all about jobs and rations, isn't it? But no, I enjoy what I do as a backbencher, ploughing a furrow, however lonely it might be. The problem, if I was ever, in a fanciful state to become a minister, I'd probably end up resigning about something far too quickly. And it'd be a bit of a waste of time for everybody all concerned, wouldn't it?
And your concern this week is about planning reforms, and you're hoping you might get a degree of watering down of these reforms. But you understand what the government's trying to do. They've got to hit this 300,000 a year target, haven't they, somehow?
Oh, completely.
And that means building more homes.
It does. And I think what the key thing is, though, with the planning reform, we haven't actually seen the bill and what it contains. And actually, although I might have, on an opposition day, on a completely inconsequential and non-binding motion, voted a certain way to show my view that actually communities should always have the involvement in the planning process. I think subsequent conversations that I've had have been encouraging, and I want to be in a state where I can support the measures that the government bring forward, because as you say, Chris, it really is vital that the number of homes, the right types of homes, and that those homes are in the right place. It's an absolutely imperative thing for the government to do.
And just back to your rebellious record of late, do you have a list of Wragg red lines which you will not cross? You know, it's locked away in, imagine, a drawer in your castle somewhere, and you look at it and go, well, no, I can't vote for that. I don't tell them.
I think it's a question sometimes of not confusing my natural stubbornness with my principles. And they're interchangeable, it seems. And so I think if I was to be, indulge in a slight bit of a histrionics, I'd probably see myself as a sort of 18th century John Bull type who doesn't like being bossed around,
yes,
who can be truculent, but can hopefully do it in a way that people can understand and appreciate the purpose of it.
Thank you, William Wragg, and more power to your elbow. May you keep holding this government to account on behalf of your constituents. Thank you for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. Great fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Well, that's all for this week. Thanks to my guests, the Telegraph's very own political editor and part-time documentary maker, Ben Riley-Smith, Tory MP William Wragg, and Britannia's biographer, Richard Johnstone-Bryden. Thank you to my producers, Louisa Wells, Elliot Lampitt, and Theodora Luludis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. Please let me know your thoughts on all the subjects we've discussed today, including the Royal Yacht. Please get in touch by emailing us, chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, or find us on Twitter. We're at Choppers Podcast. That's what a fellow Chris did last week. He emailed in to let me know in no uncertain terms, I must tell you, what he thought about our Brexit discussion last week with Kate Hoey and David Jones. As you pointed out, Chris, that was one side of the argument. We are quite keen to hear from Brexiteers about how they think Brexit is going, but we'll certainly get our teeth stuck into the subject again from all sides of the argument very soon. Another way you can share your thoughts is by leaving us a review and a rating on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other people find this show. And as ever, please do buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph if you can. Until next time, though, cheerio!